do a few different varieties where we have sort of 1 meter bamboo poles. We do what we call pole feeding. So that just gives us a bit of distance and mobility and what we can do with the food and what we can make the croc do, whether it be jumping, lunging, going for big bites to demonstrate their jaw power.
Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Nick Youngman, who is a toxicologist and a herpetologist out of Queensland, Australia. He currently works at the Billabong Sanctuary, which is an animal refuge for native wildlife species in Australia, including some massive crocodiles. So we spent a good portion of this conversation with Dr. Youngman explaining what it's like to work with such impressive animals, including one saltwater croc that is over 5 meters long, which is very close to the world record of the largest croc on planet Earth. In my mind, I cannot picture what that must be like in person, and it's an incredible part of the conversation, just learning what it's like to work with an incredible animal like that. And of course, we talk about his venom research. He actually did his PhD under Dr. Brian Fry, which is, one of the top famous names when it comes to venom research, and we discuss what it means to research venom. We discuss the components, what make up venom, how venom works, some of the evolutionary mechanisms as far as the prey and predator relationship between venomous animals and the animals they eat. It's completely fascinating. And of course, we discuss the venomous aspect of monitor lizards, something that we brought up several times on the podcast, kind of as a more of an anecdotal basis. We've had people on the podcast who have been bitten by monitors who are very adamant that they are venomous, but Nick breaks down the science, what proves that they are venomous. So this is an incredibly enjoyable conversation, and I know you will love it as well. If you're looking for more information on this podcast, make sure you head to animalsathomenetwork.com. If you would like to help support the podcast, as many of you know, it's expensive to run the show. It's not free for me to produce. A, it takes a lot of my time, but B, it costs me hundreds of dollars a month, well over $500 a month to make sure the show is edited, and I pay for the space for it to be hosted and et cetera, equipment. So if you do want to chip in a couple of dollars a month, I am super grateful for that. If you would like to do that, you can do that at patreon.com/animalsathome. Thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring the podcast. As you can see, there are you probably can't see because for those who are listening, all my lights are off right now because it's the evening time. Just the halogens are running, so you can't really see anything behind me. But this room is evolving. I have some incredible plans for this room, including some really cool artwork that I plan on hanging that's going to just look, anyway, that's for YouTube. If you want to follow me on YouTube, you can see those videos. And like I said, Custom Reptile Habitats did supply these for me. If you're looking for more enclosures or more information about their enclosures, you can head to the affiliate links in either the YouTube description or the show notes. And if you do make a purchase, a commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you, which is another way that you can support the show. Let's jump into this incredible episode. Enjoy. Well, Dr. Youngman, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's good to be here, mate. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. And as we were just saying off air, I'm always excited to have an Australian on. It's always difficult to connect just because the time zones are never quite good to overlap. So I'm happy that we could have you on. And you were a recommendation from Tyson over at Doc Merton. People are aware of him on Instagram as well. And so I'm super excited to get into lots of the topics today. I would love to hear a little bit about your education background, just to give people a foundation of what you're coming to the show with. Maybe you could just tell us the education that you've achieved over the years, but I'd also love to know what got you fascinated, what made you decide to, pursue what you did through your education.
Yeah, so if we're being formal, I am Dr. Youngman. I've done a PhD. Just finished that about 6 months ago. So straight out of high school, when I turned 18, I went to university at the University of Queensland here in Australia. Did a Bachelor's of Science, majored in zoology. So throughout that, I was doing work on pretty much all groups of animals, birds, mammals, reptiles. And then during that, doing my Bachelor's of Science, there was a second-year field course where we went to Fraser Island doing field ecology. So really cool. One of the researchers there was Dr. Brian Fry. So pretty much a household name in venom research. Mm-hmm. And met him, we were chatting. I'd seen some of his documentaries before on Komodo dragons and over on Komodo Island. So we were having some good chats, and that sort of spiraled me down a path to work in his lab. So I did my honors research with him, actually published my honors research as well. It was on some really cool Aussie snakes known as mud adders. Then after my honors, just worked as a research tech for a little bit and started getting into the teaching side at the university a bit. And then I also did my PhD there. So I just pretty much consistently, from the time I was 18, I was like straight into just uni life, which I've taken a little bit of a break from now, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But yeah, that sort of was my progression. Here in Australia, it can be a bit quicker in some regards because we don't have to do a master's. So our honours year is sort of the equivalent to a European or American master's degree. So we can go straight into our PhD off the back of that if we have sort of enough of a reference to get the scholarship.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
so that was exciting, but also very fast paced.
I imagine.
Was.
Yeah. And did you have a fascination in venom when you were doing your undergrad degree? Was that something that you thought you would want to pursue, or was this just sort of an interaction with Dr. Fry that you sort of built this passion for it?
Yeah, definitely. Meeting him sort of sparked that. I mean, venomous animals are awesome. You grew up in Australia, venomous snakes are just a household occurrence. So always found them interesting, but I definitely had a more broader interest in wildlife in general. A lot of my family were farmers, country people, so I grew up around nature. I grew up actually just down the road from Australia Zoo. I used to, as a kid, go there. I saw Steve Irwin doing his shows back in the day. So I always just had that sort of appreciation for wildlife. And then one thing just sort of led to another.
And for those, I think most people should be aware of who Dr. Brian Fry is. I've read his book, his memoir book, Venom Doc, and if anyone hasn't read that, they should, because he just seems like kind of basically like a cowboy, just really wild. I don't know how else to describe him. Like when you read his book, you're like, this is just insane. He just sounds like he's just dives into what he's interested in and has no interest of his own welfare or well-being, because he just allows himself to chase whatever he's interested in. What is it like working with him?
Yeah, I mean, I know he wouldn't mind me saying this either. He back in the day, he was one crazy man. Still, somewhat is. He's tamed down, I think, a little bit nowadays. But he's certainly been there and done it all. He's just a wealth of knowledge when it comes to venomous animals, not just from one area, but from every area around the world. And not just snakes either, but scorpions, spiders, lizards, fish. If it's got venom, he's interested in it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, yeah.
Well,
but yeah, working for him was great.
He's taken quite a few bites too, according to the book that I read. I mean, he seems like he's taken a lot of bites from, pretty intense animals, and somehow continues to truck along.
Yeah, I mean, him and a lot of people in the field. I sort of always joke, I think if you talk to someone and they say they haven't been bitten by anything, it's because they haven't been doing it for that long, myself included. If you talk to anyone over the age of 40 or 50 who's been in the venomous animal game for a while, they've probably been hit a few times. It's one of those things that you can't be perfect every time you do your work right. There's probably going to be a time when you slip up.
Yeah.
So it's one of the risks of the job, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. That seems like a pretty significant risk, but he seems to be getting along just fine. And yeah, he does seem like a wealth of information and probably a pretty fascinating person to work with. I'm sure you probably learned an intense amount just being in the same setting as him every day.
Yeah, definitely. And when I started in the lab in particular, he was very hands-on in there quite a lot. As professors from any university are, they're always traveling and always got a million commitments. But it was really good when I first started. He was with me a lot of the time too, involved in a lot of the research directly with me. And then later on throughout my PhD, I was sort of driving it myself at that point though. So yeah, learned just an incredible amount.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, and we'll get into, I want to dig into the venom research as well just in a little bit because I'm very curious about that. But why don't we, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, that you've moved away from academia, as a regular job for right now, maybe you could fill us in on what you're doing on a day-to-day basis today.
Yes, I finished my PhD. I actually finished it a bit over a year ago. And then obviously the finalizations take a little while. So a little bit over a year ago, I moved up to a place called Townsville in North Queensland. Beautiful, hot, very hot. Um, and most importantly, lots of crocs. So I moved up here. There's a sanctuary, Billabong Sanctuary, small privately owned zoo. And one of the big focuses of the zoo is the big crocs we have. So I joined the reptile department as one of the 2 reptile keepers. And I thought, I've done venomous snakes now. Need to get some experience with something a little bit bigger.
Yeah. Did you have any croc experience before that?
No, I didn't. So one of the main reasons that I moved up here was they were in need of someone with venomous snake experience as well.
Gotcha.
There's quite a small department, small zoo, and they didn't have anyone super experienced with venomous snakes at the time. So I've taken over with that. And then obviously, as well as the rest of the reptile department, with helping with all the other animals. But Crocs was a first for me, and that was very exciting to begin. Very, very different to what you might think to begin with, but definitely never a boring day.
What do you mean by different?
2 croc shows a day.
What was different than you expected?
Some of the maintenance, say when we're mowing the enclosures, you'd think that would be a bit more dangerous, but that's actually pretty easy. They just stay in the water, they feel the vibrations, and they leave you alone. Cleaning some of so we have 2 types of ponds at the zoo, concrete ponds or earthen ponds. So concrete ponds we can drain out, basically a big swimming pool. I never expected, one thing I never expected was that I would be getting down into the bottom of the swimming pool with them to scrub that out.
What?
Because, yeah, I know, right? So you got this 4.5 meter, 700 kilogram croc just standing not that far from you. But for the most part, not always, but for the most part, they just sit there and watch you because there's no water and they know they can't drown you. So they just do nothing.
Wow.
Not always, but for the most part.
Well, I guess you get good at reading their body language and, you don't just approach them as a surprise.
No, yeah, certainly always watching their body language, reading every sort of movement and what that'll mean for their next move.
Is it all saltwater crocs or is there a couple different species?
So we're actually very fortunate as of a few months ago, we have 4 crocodilian species, which doesn't seem like much probably for a zoo overseas, but here in Australia, there's only 5 species in the whole country in captivity. So we're one of only a couple of places that have a Papua New Guinea freshwater croc, so Crocodilus novaguineae. And then we also have both the Aussie species, freshwater and saltwater crocs. And we have American alligators. Okay. Which most zoos over here have American alligators.
And what's the largest animal? I'm sure it's a saltwater croc. What is is it 4.5 meters? I'm sure. Is that the biggest one?
No. So world record at the moment, 5.5 meters, Cassius on Green Island. So he's the world record. Our biggest croc is 5.1, 5.2 meters.
Oh, so my gosh.
Only just a smidge under the world record.
When I think about that, because sometimes I'll sit on my couch and I'll look at the floor to the ceiling, which is 8 feet, so whatever that is, 2.5 meters, and I think that would be half of one of those crocodiles. And to me, who's never seen or been around an animal that large, like a crocodile that large, it's just I cannot compute it. Like there's just no way, no picture will do that justice. I can't, in my mind, there's no way for me to use my imagination to formulate an animal that, like a crocodile that large. What is it like getting close to something like that? Like, I'm sure the first time it must have looked massive.
Yeah, I mean, he's just monstrous. And with the big crocs, the way they grow, saltwater or estuarine crocs, when they hit the 4 meter mark for the boys, the girls never get over 3 meters. So the boys, they get to around 4 meters, and then it's all about weight. They still grow a little bit in length each year, but for reference, we've got a croc who's 3.8 meters. Still big, like that's still a big croc. He probably weighs 400 kilo. Our big boy Krakatoa is 5.1, 5.2 meters. Only just over a meter bigger. He weighs nearly triple what that croc weighs. He'd be weighing around 1 to 1.1 ton. So
Wow.
when you see it's not only the length in the big crocs, but it's the chest, it's the stomach, it's the height of them when they stand up on their front legs. Um, it's incredible. It's something else.
And are they still quite mobile at that size? Is he able to move quite sharply?
In the water, certainly.
Oh yeah.
On land, yeah, once they're that weight, I mean, they're pretty slow on land. Still not as slow as you'd think, but yeah, definitely they're not cheetahs or anything.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And
but
then when you're
in
working,
the water, they lose no mobility. They're always fast in the water.
well, I can imagine. I mean, the size of their tail, they must get so much power and propulsion just from you add a meter to the length of a tail. As long as they have that thickness of the girth and the muscle, they can probably just swim insanely fast.
Yeah, yeah, they can pretty much always swim their body length in under a second. So the big crocs just get faster and faster.
Wow. And what sort of work do you do with them as far as interacting with them? Is there some training involved? I'm sure you're obviously feeding and whatnot, but you said you're doing some shows. So what sort of activities do you do in the shows?
Yeah, so we do 2 shows a day, and at the park we do in enclosure shows. So there's a lot of obviously rules and training that goes into it. We never go in alone or anything like that. Um, Often you'll have someone feeding and then someone guarding whoever's feeding, and potentially extra people depending on the kind of show. But for that, we do a few different varieties where we have sort of 1 meter bamboo poles. We do what we call pole feeding. So that just gives us a bit of distance and mobility and what we can do with the food and what we can make the croc do, whether it be jumping, lunging, going for big bites to demonstrate their jaw power. And then sometimes we do a little bit of hand feeding as well, where you get them to lunge. But you can't really demonstrate as much with the hand feeding. That's more showy for the crowd. I think it doesn't demonstrate the same amount you can with the pole feeding.
Right.
So yeah, but we get right in there, get in their enclosures. And what's really cool about the park is that a lot of our enclosures are natural. So completely murky water. Crowd doesn't see the croc until it lunges up at one of us. I don't see the croc till it lunges up at
Oh my God, that's
myself
crazy.
sometimes. They'll be sitting 2 millimeters under the water, and that water's completely murky. You can't see them until they lunge.
That is crazy. I get
very
scared
natural.
feeding my boas. I can't imagine a 5 meter croc jumping out at me.
Yeah, you definitely. There's some days where you're like, "Oh, that was intense."
Oh, wow. And do like, so these are those scenarios where you have, these are wild animals in a captive setting. As many safety protocols as you put in place, you always hear those horror stories where, people make a mistake. Is that, like, in your opinion, is that, like, are these animals always capable of, I mean, we know they're always capable of doing, something like that, but are they so used to you guys that there's a danger where you guys could become complacent because you're like, oh, he never snap at me. We don't have any aggression with these alligators or these crocs. And then one day, somebody gets a little bit too close and the croc, decides that I'm going after this meal. Is that always a danger?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's probably the biggest danger is us getting complacent. The crocs are smart. They usually go for the food because we're dangling a chicken, and they know getting that chicken is going to be easy, much easier than dragging down a whole person and trying to take them down. But by no means are they tame. We've got one croc. He's been there since the park opened 38 years ago.
Wow.
Been there 38 years. He knows what's going on. He knows the routine. I've personally had him launch up while I'm in there with another keeper who was feeding him and chase us out the back gate with no intention of stopping. He would have grabbed one of us 100%.
Wow.
And we've had that happen with multiple other crocs. I've run out the back gate multiple times to get away from a croc that was quite clearly in no mood of stopping.
Wow.
Sometimes you can just see their eye movements. One of the big things we read is eye movements. You see them looking at the chicken, and then you see them look at your leg, and then they go for your leg.
Yeah.
And it's quite obvious. You really do see that. You just see them look at your leg and go, okay, today I choose you.
Yeah. That looks a lot like a chicken too.
Yeah.
So where can you tell us some of the, you said that one's been there for 38 years and you called it a sanctuary to begin with. Are these animals that were, rescued as a, like where did they come from?
So most of ours are wild caught problematic crocodiles. So
Okay.
here in Australia, there's in Queensland, which is the state I live in, the department regulates if a croc goes into a certain area and it's over a certain size, they remove it without question. So there's a lot of rules about where they want crocs to be based upon obviously reducing human croc conflict.
Hmm.
Also, if there's any instances where a croc eats someone's dog or it's sunning itself on a boat ramp and won't move and they deem it's become too habituated and unafraid of humans, they often remove it as well. So a lot of our crocs are really big males that were removed from areas because they were too habituated to humans. Most of ours were removed from boat ramps. So we've got one big boy, he's 4.9 meters, um, and he was removed from a boat ramp. And then we've got another one that was caught on the beach here in Townsville. So he's 4.5 meters. He was actually caught on the main tourist beach 7 years
Wow.
ago. And then you see people swimming down there every weekend.
Oh my
You're
gosh.
like, oh, yeah, mental. But for the most part, yeah, they're all wild. We do have a couple that were born in captivity, but not too many.
Yeah. Yeah. It's similar to what they do with polar bears here in the province that I live in up north. Obviously, they are not an animal that you want to be sharing your space with. So if you have a problem bear, eventually they get captured and either moved really far away, which I'm not sure is the best thing, or sometimes they do end up in zoos and whatnot. But I can imagine in Australia, are there a significant amount of poor interactions between crocs and people?
Not really, not as many as the media makes it out to be.
Okay.
We
It's
have
like
had one
sharks.
death. We have had one death this year, and then one other attack where the man survived. They're the only two real major incidents that have occurred this year, and we're halfway through the year now.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's interesting though what you were saying about the polar bears. See, that's one of the issues with crocs is we can't release them somewhere else. There's been a lot of radio tracking that's been done, and a lot of research by people here in Australia. They have magnetoreceptors in their ear, just like turtles or birds do. So they just return home. They've flown them to the other side of the state before, and they've shown journeys, no detours. They'll swim 4, 5, 600 kilometers home,
Wow.
um, and be exactly in that exact same spot they were captured.
So they have to
So,
be either
so they
put into
have to be,
captivity, basically.
yeah, captivity or euthanized, sadly.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that's one of the big issues we're finding now is a lot of the either croc farms or zoos here in Australia are full. They don't have room for too many more big crocs. My park in particular, if we got offered another big male at the moment, we wouldn't have anywhere to put him. And since they can live for 100 years or more, if you do agree to take one of these big males, I mean, you have no idea of knowing how long they'll be there for.
Right. Yeah. So you guys are basically at capacity for a lifetime.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Unless you have the money and room to build more extremely large enclosures, and you can't house them together, unlike the alligators. Alligators, I know, can be a bit aggressive, but for the most part, you can house quite a few together. Estrine crocs, you put two males in together, one's going to die.
Right.
Even females sometimes. Sometimes I'll get along with a female. Other times we've got one croc. He's killed three girls. They were
Really?
trying to pair him up in the past before I was there, and he killed three girls.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're a highly aggressive species, our Australian saltwater croc.
Yeah. Yeah. They are amazing to look at, though. And I would love to see one in person just to really get a sense of that size. It's like when you see a whale, like you can't understand how big a whale is until you see it in person. And then when you do, you're like, wow, your imagination does just not stretch that far. So they are incredible. There's another thing I was going to say about that. I can't imagine catching them. If you had a problem croc in the wild that you had to catch, that sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, so the standard procedure is trapping. Just imagine a giant rat cage, except
Okay.
really, really big. Um, so they'll float that and they float it in the water. So that's usually what they try to do first if it's not like too much time concern. if they do have to catch it right away, they'll go out in boats and rope it. So you can actually get jaw ropes on, secure the
Mm.
jaw, and then, or you can harpoon it even, small little harpoons, basically just play it like a fish,
Yeah, yeah.
which is what they did in the end to Jupiter, one of the Crocs at our park. So he's the one who was caught on the beach. They couldn't rope him for whatever reason. They couldn't manage to rope him. So they actually harpooned him and dragged him onto the beach.
Wow. And then they just
Yeah,
tape them up and load them in a truck and bring them over.
yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
And then those croc farms that you mentioned, are those for actual production, like skin and meat?
Yeah. So sometimes the government will send wild caught ones there if they don't want to. If the option is croc farm or euthanize, sometimes the croc farms will take them and use them as a breeder.
Mm.
But again, a lot of those are full. Obviously, that's a very ethical debate how you feel about croc farming. Personally, until the demand stops, I mean, it's the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
The species was almost hunted to extinction here in Australia before the 1970s. There was almost none left. Um, Without the croc farms, I guess the hunting potentially would start again and it would spiral back down. So it's definitely not ideal, obviously, but it does serve a role.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, you are protecting the ecosystem and the wild animals from basically what would happen anyway.
Yeah.
Well,
So some of the big males do go there sometimes when they're caught, but it just depends on the scenario.
it's a really fascinating side, and I'm sure that you've had a blast getting to work with that, especially coming from venomous snakes to large crocodiles. It's quite a shift, and you're acquiring quite a lot of experience in the reptile world now. You're dealing with probably some of the most dangerous animals. I mean, I think you have some monitor experience as well, but you're really checking off all the boxes of the animals that most people don't have any life chance of having an experience with, or maybe even want to, because of the danger factor.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm always passionate about is just moving forward. I like to always be moving on to the next exciting thing and not getting stale with anything.
Yeah.
So moving on to Crocs has really kept me on my toes a bit and
I don't know where you go
reignited
from
some
5 meter
passion.
Crocs though.
Yeah, that is a bit of a conundrum. I know gigantic pythons. I've never had the pleasure of working with any really big like retics or berms, but that could give me a challenge perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a whole other ball game for sure. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the research, the venom research that you did, because everybody knows that there's lots of venom research that goes into universities, whether it's for anti-venom or medicinal purposes and pharmaceuticals and whatnot. But I'm actually just curious, in general, what does it look like to research venom? What are you doing in the lab, just kind of on a general procedure basis, to actually study venom?
Yeah, so in general, I mean, it sounds so flashy, doesn't it? Venom research sounds like you're just playing with taipans all day and
Yeah.
milking snakes every day. Um, but for most people doing the research, it's much more lab-based, very computerized nowadays too. Lot more robotics go into it. So for my whole degree, I never actually milked a single snake. Um,
Really?
yeah. So everyone's like, "Oh, you must have been milking snakes every day." No, I didn't milk one actually. Um, the venom, you can milk a snake, store it in the freezer. It lasts for years
Mm.
if you store it properly. So one of the really cool things about the lab I was in, with all the traveling that Dr. Fry had done, he had collected a really, really substantial collection of venoms from all over the world. So our freezers were chock a blocks with pretty much, if you can name a venomous animal, we probably had the venom in the freezer somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, so that was a really good thing I was able to get my hands on for the research, a lot of rare venoms. Downside is there was no need for me to go out and milk it myself. So
Yeah.
there wasn't too much field work involved.
But at
Um,
least, it's a little safer that way too.
It is. So yeah, a lot of the people who work in venom research don't want to handle venomous animals really. They do it because they're either biochemists or because they have that scientific background and an interest in it. So a lot of it is using different robotic systems to test the venom on either in vitro or in vivo assays.
Mm.
So a lot of the work I did was on human blood and looking at how different venoms affect coagulation. So I would just collect blood samples, collect the venom, and then do different assays in the lab day to day. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about the compounds that make up venom, because I think a lot of times we know venom is a toxin. We know that if it gets injected into your bloodstream, it's very bad. But there's probably a lot of people that just have no idea what it's made out of. Like what is in venom that makes it so toxic to whatever it's being injected into?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with venom is it's not just one thing either.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many different toxins, and they're all doing so much, both at the same time, and then building upon one another synergistically. So it's very complex. Some venoms are quite straightforward, like sea snake venom, has a few different toxins in it, neurotoxins for the most part, and they cause paralysis. So pretty simple.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you've got things, I used to work on a lot of viper venoms. My PhD was on puff adders and gaboon vipers, so bitter species from Africa. Their venom is just so complex. There's dozens of different toxins in there, and some of them are attacking cell tissue, some are attacking muscle tissue, some are attacking clotting factors to stop you from bleeding or make you bleed more. And then some are neurotoxic, which I found as well. And yeah, so there's just so much going on.
Well, and what's amazing about it is sort of the evolutionary trajectory of venom and how it's been morphed over time, depending on what species you're talking about. And it's like you said, a lot of times we just think of venom as one thing, and not only is it not one thing, it's also fluid within the species, right? Like the species will oscillate over the years as they maybe change the type of prey that's in the area, and there is some flexibility on a natural selection basis for what's actually in the venom.
Yeah, certainly. So like there's a lot of, as just going back to what we were saying before, a lot of what's in the venom too, it's not the same thing either. Sometimes it's little proteins that are much smaller. Sometimes it's big enzymatic toxins. So you've got multiple different biochemical sort of formulas within that. And then, like you said, it changes. Here in Australia, we've got a lot of brown snake species. They completely shift what the babies and the adults have for their venom composition. Very different. The babies are really neurotoxic, feeding on things like lizards. And then as they age, they lose most of their neurotoxins. And what they're doing is they've got coagulotoxins, which are attacking the blood. And that's because they have that shift in their diet from little lizards when they're young to mammals and rodents when they're older.
Why would it be more like, it seems like a neurotoxin is just such a potent weapon against prey. Why would they shift towards using more of like a hemotoxin or a myotoxin venom for mammalian prey? Is it more effective on mammals?
Yeah, I'm not too certain of that myself. We do see it as a trend. Often things that are coagulotoxic, so hitting the blood system, they often are feeding upon mammals. Often we see things that are neurotoxic are feeding upon birds or lizards. Why? Not too sure. Some of the research, we're starting to really only scratch the surface, and I would love to do more of it someday too if I go back to it. One of the big passions of mine was collecting blood from different animals and looking at how the blood differs, because it's not the same. Your blood and the lizards behind you, they don't have the same things in them.
Right.
So one of the big passions I had was collecting blood from different Aussie reptiles and just testing how it clots, how long it takes to clot. And you see massive differences. So I think sometimes we have this idea of, the venom does this. But that's not true. The venom only does this on that. If you put it on something else, it does something completely different.
Yeah, and sometimes it will not be effective even in another animal.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the study that you did, I think, in that same domain with the taking blue tongue skink blood, and I think also taking a look at, was it monitor blood as well? And I don't know what species of venomous snake you were using to actually look, but you were looking at how there's almost an arms race between the prey, the blue-tongued skinks, and the predator. I forget the species of snake you were working with.
Yeah, so we're working with a few different venoms, and I collected blood from eastern blue tongues, Teliqua skincoides, and then also shinglebacks, Teliqua rugosa, and then some monitors, Parentes, Mertens water monitor, and lace monitors. So I was very fortunate to have some people with friendly Parentes and lace monitors, so I didn't get torn to shreds. So we collected the blood samples from them. That was good fun. And then, because here in Australia, Parentes are well known for feeding upon venomous snakes. So you often hear people say, oh, they're resistant. They're resistant to the venom. There's no research to show that whatsoever. It's just people say it because they eat them. And then there's a bit of research in the past that has shown maybe some lizards here in Australia are resistant. And I've always thought, why don't our big venomous snakes eat blue tongues? Like a blue tongue isn't that big and it would be a hell of a good meal, lasts them a long time. So why don't they really get taken as prey? So it was very interesting looking into that. And I tested a few different venoms from sympatric species that live in the same area. So red bellies, brown snakes, taipans, little black, what do we call them here? Small-eyed snakes as well. A few other smaller venomous snakes. And what was really interesting was all of the snakes I tested on the monitor blood crushed it. The blood was clotting. It was getting hammered by the venom. There was no resistance whatsoever. So as far as my research shows, the venom's definitely affecting the blood. The blood's not resistant. So perhaps the monitors, their scales are quite thick. Perhaps they're not getting penetrated by the fangs, which isn't really resistance to the venom. That's resistance to getting envenomated.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. If the venom gets in, that animal's screwed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's sort of where I'm thinking and what I'm leaning towards for them. But then what was also really interesting on the blue tongue blood, brown snake venom, I believe I tested tiger snake as well, a few others, they would absolutely crush it. You'd see the blood clot really quickly, and the venom would have a strong effect. But there's a species here, the red belly black snake, very common all along the East Coast, along with our blue tongues. So they occur across all the same range, same habitat. Red bellies are known to be a reptile feeding, so they like to feed upon reptiles and frogs. And the blue tongue's blood was specifically resistant to that venom. That venom had pretty much no effect on it.
Really?
So it seems like the blue tongues have co-evolved this resistance in an arms race specifically to the red belly black snakes, while not any other snakes in the area, which perhaps could come down to as well. Most of our venomous snakes in Australia, like the bigger ones like taipans, brown snakes, as adults, they're not feeding on lizards. So the blue tongues aren't really potential prey.
Right.
There's definitely a little bit more involved there as well. So
That's
it'll be
amazing.
interesting to see if we can tease it out more.
Well, I think there's a similar situation in I want to say in the West, in like California, where there's ground squirrels that are developing resistance against just rattlesnake venom. I forget what species, and it would be the same sort of thing, I imagine.
Yeah, certainly. There's no shortage of it around the world. You see things like the honey badgers are resistant, and things like mongooses, and then you see obviously the groundhogs over in America there, and you see the opossums in South America. So there's all these arms races all around the world between different animals that are getting preyed upon by venomous snakes.
Well, and when you think about it, it's got to be faster for the prey to adjust to that, because they're getting picked off, right? They're the ones that the venom is potent on. They're dying, and they're not able to pass their genetics on, and that population can quickly probably have a resistant blood over maybe, like, I don't know how, let's say 10 generations. Where if you're a snake, I feel like it would take longer for that snake's venom to evolve to now be potent against the sort of the new, the resistant blood for the prey that they were typically feeding on.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've always struggled with too. When you're talking about like how long it takes for something like this to evolve, like the amount of generations, the amount of millions of years perhaps that these animals have coexisted with one another. So obviously it's just bit by bit. The
Right.
snakes get more potent, the snakes develop a new toxin, the animals develop a new mechanism to resist that. So there's also so many different ways they can be resistant. I believe the groundhogs or the squirrels over in the Americas, they actually have something in their blood that binds to the toxin
Okay,
and sort
that's
of
cool.
and actually stops it. So basically, like eats up the toxin and prevents it from working. Whereas you have other ones, like in South America, the opossums, where their blood actually is modified to look different. It's a different shape, and the toxins can't bind to it anymore. So you can have things in the blood that prevent the toxins, or you can have modifications on your own receptors. So there's many different mechanisms as well, which is one thing we didn't work out with the blue tongues. We don't know what it is that's preventing it.
It just worked. Well, it'd be kind of
Just
like,
work, yeah.
like sickle cell anemia in Africa, right? If you have a heterozygous
Mm,
sickle cell, you actually have some resistance against malaria. It's actually a benefit in that scenario. If you have a homozygous sickle cell, that's not good. That's a pretty serious disease. But if you're carrying one trait of it, it actually provides resistance. So it is amazing how Mother Nature just bounces back and forth between, it's just an incredible to think. Like you said, how long does these things take? They're constantly interplaying with each other, and it just continues to move on.
yeah. And I think sickle cell is a great sort of example too, because it doesn't mean you're immune. One thing that I often butted heads with, sort of when this research was coming out, and you often see people um, in the media trying to say, oh, well, the blue tongues, can we use their blood to be immune? It's like, no, they're not immune. Resistance isn't immunity.
Mm-hmm.
Resistance is about surviving. Um, there might still be some effect of the venom there, but if you survive, well, then you can get away and still pass on your genetics.
Exactly. Yeah. It might be a horrible couple of days, but you had enough energy to skitter away, and you didn't immediately go into like a cardiac arrest situation and get eaten.
Yeah. So yeah, it'd be cool to see exactly how these blue tongues are doing it. I reckon there's something in their blood that's actually binding to the toxins and preventing them from taking effect. So I think they've actually got something in their blood, like an extra factor or something, probably.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. That's an incredible thought to think about. Can we talk a little bit about some of the different delivery systems for venom? I think most people are familiar with elapids, vipers, colubrids, and now we talk a lot more about lizards delivering venom as well. Can you just run through some of just the basic mechanisms? And I guess there are other ways. They have like sea snails and things that are also delivering venom, but maybe just stick with the reptiles as far as how it's getting injected into the prey.
Yeah, so when it comes to the snakes, they have their venom gland on the upper jaw, so upper side of the skull, and then it connects to the fangs. Obviously, with our lapids and our vipers, their front fangs. The lapids, it's fixed, so usually very short fang, not as large, whereas the vipers have that sort of more flexible, enlarged front fangs. Then the colubrids, it's at the back there, rear fanged. So all pretty similar though, all fangs, all getting injected through there. Whereas the lizards, it's quite interesting because I remember we were talking about this a little bit the other day. A lot of people still just don't want to accept that they're venomous for one reason or another, but they certainly are. The venom gland is quite clearly there on the lower jaw though, so it's not on the upper jaw, it's on the lower jaw. Some of the work I did at the lab helping some friends who it was more their research than mine. But we did CT and MRI scanning of different monitor lizard skulls. And you can quite clearly see the venom gland and the venom apparatus there. So they have little pores that come out beside the teeth on the lower jaw. So it's not really injected per se through like a hollow fang or anything like that. They do have to sort of bite and squeeze to envenomate the prey.
Is that an evolved like saliva gland, or do these animals still have a saliva gland? Because I can understand how venom would evolve over time. We all have glands in our mouth that create secretions. That's we have saliva, and saliva also comes with enzymes. That's what you start breaking down food in your mouth. So there, in some ways, you have this digestive mechanism in your mouth, and so do most mammals and whatever else. So you could kind of easily imagine the line that gets drawn over evolutionary time span of the enzymes and proteins that you generate become more and more toxic, and now it's not necessarily used for digestion. It's used for a potent ability to kill your prey. In the monitors and the lizards, is that a saliva gland that has slowly evolved, or do they still have a saliva gland, or is that not a question?
Yeah, well, from what we can see, it's a gland in itself that I guess at the beginning it was just part of the mouth there, but it's now compartmentalized to secrete different proteins.
Mm-hmm.
They still have saliva as well, certainly.
Okay.
So yeah, they still have sort of, with your salivary glands, they're more sort of throughout your mouth.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So they still have those sort of excretory cells, but then the venom glands are a much more compartmentalized gland.
Okay, so it's a very separate piece. It has its own.
Yeah. And you can quite distinctly see it as a separate structure.
Right. Well, and that's what I always find interesting about even with the monitors is people that I know who I've heard a lot of stories of people taking bites who will tell you that they are venomous after after anyone takes a bite from a monitor. Quite often they're not. They think that they're venomous because of the reaction that they had. But a lot of times I hear people saying I barely took a bite. It was like a scrape across my hand, still opening up the skin and whatnot, but there was still enough venom in the mouth to obviously get inside the cut and actually get, inject is not the right word, but, permeate the skin. So I imagine that their mouth must be just teeming with that venom.
Yeah, I don't think we've really looked at it properly to see how much they sort of have.
Okay.
Just sort of sitting there in reserve. So obviously when they bite, if they squeeze, then that exudes more venom.
Mm-hmm.
So it is with the bite. How much just sits in there normally? I don't think we've really quantified that.
Yeah.
But you hear a lot. I just had someone recently get bit up here by an Ackie monitor, and even he was like, "This is still bleeding." So
yeah,
a lot of the venom we've shown in the lab too. The venom has things that are like fibrinogen-lytic, so they cleave fibrinogen to cause persistent bleeding. So they have a lot of different toxins in there that target our blood factors to keep the bleeding going.
Right.
And you do hear that a lot with people who get bit. They say, well, yeah, they're sharp teeth, but I would normally stop bleeding if I had, a normal cut this sort of size. But if you get a monitor bite, you often hear anecdotal evidence of that where the bleeding just is a lot more than what people would expect.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you don't need a ton for it to really, I mean, you think about a bee sting, if you had someone poked you with a tiny little needle the size of a bee stinger, you wouldn't even feel it. But the fact that there's something also in there that's causing a skin reaction and it's itchy and it's inflamed and yeah, you know that there's something more that's now in your skin than just simply like the physical, like the damage of the skin.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's hard for us to picture too is monitor lizards most certainly did not evolve their venom to hunt humans. We are a much bigger animal. When we get bit on the hand or something like that, that small amount of venom is probably causing a much more localized effect. But on what they're actually eating, their actual prey is much smaller for the most part for most species. So how that's affecting their prey is going to be very different to the clinical effects that you see on a human. It's the same thing we see even with snakes here in Australia, the brown snakes and taipans. What the venom does to a mouse is very different to what it does to a human because a human is not a mouse. We are have a much bigger blood volume. So you've got to wrap your head around the fact that they didn't evolve that venom. What it does to humans is not actually what it does.
Yeah. We look at everything through our own lens, right? It's like, it's not really going to affect me if I get bit by that thing. But every fish that's around a sea snake, it's a horrible day. Well, I know that that venom is quite potent and toxic for us too. But it is interesting the way we do that. We're constantly just like the LD50, for example, like you said, it's sort of an arbitrary potency scale as far as how toxic something is when we're dealing with mice.
Yeah, certainly. 100%.
Now, can we talk a little bit? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right. Is it Toxicofera Clade? Is that how you say it?
Now I'm going to butcher it too. Toxicofera.
Toxicofera. Okay,
Yeah, at least
Toxicofera.
that's how I say it anyway. I'm pretty sure that's how
So
most people say it.
for those of you who've never heard that word, apparently I haven't heard it before either. Can you tell us about what that is, and then we'll talk about why how it's been criticized. And I think did Dr. Fry, is he the one that proposed this originally, or?
Yeah, him
Okay.
as well as some other researchers together in a very big paper that got published. That'll be over a decade now. So it's definitely, it's not a new theory. It's been around for years now, years. But it's the idea that venomous snakes and monitor lizards, and obviously your heloderma lizards as well, all our venomous reptiles, they all originate from a common ancestor.
Mm.
So they all originate from a common ancestor, and then certain species have lost their venom over time within that. So, certain species obviously have lost their venom, whereas others have kept it.
And so what would because that sort of seems logical considering how strange of an evolutionary design venom is. It's kind of a bizarre thing to create, and to it is expensive for an animal to have. So you could kind of imagine them having a common ancestor as far as But what would be the criticism that people have as far as not accepting that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty widely accepted now. A lot of the original criticisms were, I guess, that snakes are so different to things like our varanids, our monitor lizards,
Mm-hmm.
And then heloderma. And then for just a long while, people, for whatever reason, just didn't want to accept that monitor lizards were venomous. They didn't either believe that there was a venom gland, or then they didn't want to believe that the venom actually is venom. Like you were saying before, how is it maybe just not saliva? So there's still a lot of debate going around what the venom actually does and how you define venom compared to just saliva. Obviously, it has to have a role in prey capture or defense. And there's still a bit of debate about what that role is for our varanids. But one thing that is interesting always to me is the heloderma, our Gila monsters, are so widely accepted as venomous.
Yeah, I was just going to say
And
that.
why can't people wrap their heads around that there'd be a few more lizards that are venomous? Like, that's not a stretch or anything.
Yeah. It's weird. It doesn't really make sense. You kind of do wonder why there's pushback, especially when there's some evidence. But even from a layman's point of view, to me, when you talk about a venom gland in the skull, in the jaw, I don't understand how that's not a slam dunk as far as, yes, these animals are venomous.
Yeah. Certainly. I think one of the issues, and I even sometimes think of myself, I'm like, well, some of the really little monitor lizards, the size of your hand, they're eating things like crickets.
Mm-hmm.
What do they use that venom for? Perhaps they don't really need it as much as they used to. Perhaps it's a trait that they're losing. Perhaps some of them in another 10 million years won't be venomous. But as a group, as a whole, they definitely are in possession of that venom apparatus.
Now, is there anything in their dental structure that helps the delivery of venom through the bite? Like, is there grooved teeth or anything that they find, or is this just a secretion into the mouth that gets bitten into the prey?
So the teeth have the grooves coming up, the venom's near the teeth, and then the teeth themselves are serrated and extraordinarily sharp. If anyone's ever been bit by a monitor lizard before, they can attest to how sharp those teeth are. So that definitely opens up the wound for the venom to be pressed into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. I mean, and you can kind of see, it kind of goes back to the original story you were talking about with people assuming that the Parentes, for example, were resistant to snakes because they're or venomous snakes, because they're kind of using their observation skills, seeing them eat the venomous snakes and go, oh, they can't get killed. And the same thing with monitors, right? That's where that mouth teeming of bacteria sort of came, because they're biting their prey are wandering off and eventually maybe dying, or whatever that theory was. That's why it's so important to actually do proper science and not just go off the observation. The observation is really important too, but it can really lead you astray as far as, collecting proper data.
Yeah, I think when they did the work on the Komodo dragons, I think they showed that the bacterial load in their mouth is less than ours. In terms of
Yeah.
the actual, in terms of the actual bacterial load and what they've got in their mouth, that in regard to that, it's nothing extraordinary. You go
Yeah.
out and swab any animal's mouth in the world, and there's going to be stuff in it, right? Like animals don't brush their teeth every twice a day.
Yeah. Bacteria is just part of life. It's just
Yeah,
everywhere.
everything has bacteria in its mouth. That's nothing
Yeah.
special.
But even thinking, and it's interesting too, thinking about the criticism, or thinking about the smaller species of monitor, are they carrying venom and whatnot? But we have examples like that on the colubrid side too, right? We have, garter snakes in North America are technically venomous, but what are they using the venom for? I mean, I guess maybe subduing prey, but it's a pretty small and not very potent venom. Like you said, maybe it is more potent for an amphibian prey or something like that, or something small. But you could see how these animals could slowly shed the need to develop venom, because it is probably expensive biologically to produce. But you can still see the evolutionary steps, how they have it and how they can step away from it as well.
Yeah. So colubrids are something I haven't done a lot of work on myself. But they're one that really interests me too, because you've got so many colubrids that aren't venomous. And
Right.
then others that are, like you said, the garter snakes are potentially got some venom in there, but it's not doesn't seem to be anything potent. Then you've got others like in Africa, the twig snakes and the Thelatornis,
Hmm.
potently venomous. Put you in the worst day of your life real quick.
Yeah.
So as a group, as a whole, the colubrids are very interesting to me, because there's obviously a lot going on there, with some perhaps moving away from being venomous, some are still refining and becoming, very dangerously venomous. So there's a lot of different evolutionary trajectories going on there.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Now, I know you have venomous animals at Billabong. Do you keep any animals at home? Do you have any? Would you ever keep venomous animals in your as captive in your own house, or is that something you save for work?
Um, Currently, I just save it for work. In the future, who knows? So at the park, we have most of your stock standard Australian snakes. We have inland taipans, coastal taipans, uh, tiger snakes, death adders, Collette's black snake. So quite a nice variety of your venomous species. And then we have some on display, and then most of them are actually off display. I do a venomous snake show there, as well as one of the other keepers does as well. So we do venomous snake shows to the public. I feel like I get enough of a fill for that work. Um,
Yeah.
I don't really need to then have the stress, because it is one of those things working with venomous snakes. As I said before, I haven't been bit yet, which I'm very thankful for. But I by no means say that as like I'm an amazing snake handler or anything. It's only because I have only done this for a short period of time, a few years. If you talk to anyone who's been doing it for years and years and years and years and years, they've probably been bit,
Yeah.
because it's something where you've got to be on the ball. You've got to be perfect every time you handle those snakes. If you're doing it for a job 5, 6, 7 days a week, yeah, there's probably going to be a day where you mess up, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so obviously that's not the goal. You don't want to ever mess up, but
Yeah.
I don't believe anyone should ever be so arrogant to think that, you know,
It
they're
can't
going to be
happen.
perfect.
Yeah.
That it can't happen, and that they're so perfect as a snake handler that it won't happen.
Yeah, so it's probably best to only have that risk in one part of your life, not necessarily go to work and then come home and also have that risk. I mean,
Yeah,
I would hate to have venomous snakes for that reason, just because if you're tired, you can't do anything. You have to
Mm.
be on all the time. Like you said, you can't just, they need the fresh water. Like if you're not mentally in the right space to change the water, then you're gonna have to leave it or wake
Yeah,
yourself up and
definitely.
get ready to go.
And I've had days like that, and that's where it's sometimes hard as a keeper, because obviously you want to be providing the best care for your animals 24/7. But I've had days where there'll be a poo in the corner of the enclosure, and I want to clean that poo out straight away, but I've got a headache, and I've just worked an 8-hour day, and I go, well, no, I'll do it in the morning, because I'm just not. I don't want to get that snake out right now.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, in Australia, is like as you had said earlier, it's there's venomous snakes all over the place. It's just part of life there. Is that a serious concern as far as interactions? We talked about the Crocs not being overly actually that big of a problem as far as people getting bitten or eaten. Do people get bit a lot by venomous snakes in Australia?
No, we're very fortunate here for a few reasons. One, most of our snakes are all elapids. So for the most part, most of our snakes move. They feel you coming, walking through the ground, or they hear you coming, they move away. We do have our death adders, which are similar to vipers, in fact, they're a small ambush stocky species, so they don't really move. But again, they're very reluctant to bite. So unless you stand on one or really stand super close to one, they're not going out of their way to strike. So we're very fortunate. Obviously, Africa, places like that, they have puff adders, lots of different viper species that are not reluctant to bite, in my opinion, and don't move if they feel you coming. So that's one reason. And then also, if you do get bit here, which is something I say in the shows, as long as you're not an idiot, you're probably going to survive. Just go to the hospital.
Yeah.
We have most of our snakes have very similar venom composition, and then we have a polyvalent antivenom in our country. So it's made from the 5 main groups: death adder, brown snakes, black snakes, taipans, tiger snakes. So we don't need to know what bit you. We don't have to ID the snake. You just go to hospital. That polyvalent antivenom cover pretty much anything that could have bit you in our country. And you get as much as you need free of charge. There's no medical bills associated with it here.
Oh, wow.
You'll get as much antivenom as you need.
Well, and that's the benefit of the strict reptile and just animal laws that Australia has, right? In the States, you could be bit by anything because anybody could have whatever, and if you can't dictate
get out of Florida and who knows what's roaming around.
Exactly. Yeah. You're talking about the wild, invasive issues. You could really get bit by anything, but also in private collections, people have everything. And the chances of somebody in the hospital having antivenom is pretty much zero if you are keeping an exotic species. Where in Australia, like you said, you got the 5, there's a polyvalent antivenom. That's a pretty simple, give the antivenom and they're good to go.
Yeah, it's something, and again, captive keeping, exotics are illegal here. So, for better or worse, there's some pros and cons to that. But if you're a private keeper as well, you should only have native species.
Right.
And so I think statistics are currently showing we have 1 death per year, sometimes 2, from venomous snake bite in Australia, 1 to 2, and we have all of the world's most venomous snakes.
Yeah.
We have over 100 species here that could kill you. Over 100 venomous snake species that can kill you. And we have like 1 to 2 deaths a year. And quite often, about 50% of the bites that occur are people who are doing venomous snake handling as a job.
Right. So just your regular person, really, there's absolutely no risk at all.
There's very little risk. Obviously, farmers, people hiking, there is a risk. There's, of course, a risk. But it's by no means some frequent thing where people are getting bitten every day.
Yeah. Or when you move over to Africa and India, that's a really common occurrence, and you're dealing with animals that are actually less potent, Russell's viper or rough-scale viper, but because of the healthcare conditions and, distance to hospitals and whatnot, people are dying or getting maimed all the time by venomous snakes.
Certainly. And that's one thing I always say is like some of those vipers overseas, they're not as venomous as a taipan. They're still venomous enough to kill you. Yes. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's the most venomous snake in the world or 50th. It's still venomous enough to kill you. So
if you don't have antivenom, it's a big problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you have, so as you said, you're kind of, you finished your PhD, so now you're doing more of a, working at the zoo, and do you have, you already kind of mentioned that, eventually you'd love to get back into research and whatnot, but do you have any questions or things that you want to answer if you do get back into doing venom research? Like, are there things that like burning questions that you think I would love to research that if I do get back into it?
I mean, definitely, if no one beats me to it, I definitely want to finish off what I started with the blue tongue work. Mm-hmm. I find that fascinating. I also just personally, as a keeper, I do keep quite a good private collection at home, a few species. And I do love blue tongues. So I find them just very interesting as well. That's one of the reasons I also started that research,
Hmm.
just to spend some more time with those sort of animals and
Yeah, yeah.
do some research on them because I think they're just really awesome. Moving away from venom, though, I would consider myself a herpetologist rather than a toxicologist. Venom was what I have done in the past, but reptiles in general is where my interest is. And particularly here in Australia, we have a lot of social species like Alleghania. Um, so I keep a few of them privately, Digi skinks and
Mm.
Cunningham skinks. And I find that the social dynamics within them just fascinating. So I'd definitely love to do some more research on that. And there's already some really cool research going on at some of the universities here in Australia on that.
Yeah, I feel like that's really going to be the next wave of. There's already been lots of research on that as well. That's kind of laid a foundation, but just the social interactions between reptiles, I think will do a lot just as far as really showing people how intelligent they are. We talk about it on the podcast all the time. Quite often, the issue that we're having on the welfare side is many people believe reptiles in general have a very low ability to cognitively problem solve and whatnot, and that's why they end up getting put into relatively poor conditions. And I think proving some social aspect to some species really go a long way to showing that these animals are they deserve a well put together habitat for keeping them in captivity, and they're capable of thinking and problem solving and interacting with each other.
Yeah, certainly. It's something that's just very fascinating. I mean, monitor lizards again. Another thing that's always interested me about them is their intelligence is sort of unquestionable at this point. They're definitely an intelligent reptile.
Mm-hmm.
But even most of our other species and a lot of our skinks in Australia, you can see them thinking them through, making decisions. You can see them adapting to their environment and to their surroundings. I've got a colony of Digi skinks here at home. I can walk in and hand feed them.
Mm-hmm.
They won't hide. If you walked in that room right now, they'd disappear, all of them.
That's fascinating.
If I have people over, they disappear. But if I walk in, they'll let me hand feed them, not a problem. So they clearly recognize that difference in just an individual as well coming in and what they recognize as a potential threat or not. And then again, they're living as a colony, so family groups are social as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's going to be interesting next year. Actually, I don't know how much I can say about it for now, but I do have a PhD student from the University of Adelaide. She's going to be working with me up here at the zoo and coming to do an internship with me. And her whole PhD is on cognition and intelligence in reptiles as well. So we're working out what we're going to do at the moment and what kind of stuff we'll look into, but hoping to really pull together a few things we can look at.
Oh, that'll be fascinating. And that'll be kind of cool too from your point of view, right? Not being the person that has to write the PhD, you get to help and learn and, help guide the study, but not actually having the pressure of, rewriting something gargantuan.
Oh, definitely. Writing a PhD is a once in a lifetime thing. I think anyone who has gotten through one,
yeah, you don't want to do it again.
Go back and do another one.
Yeah.
But I do. I still love research. I absolutely love it, and I think that's one of the perks of working at a zoo is you can still collaborate and be involved in research. You're not completely dependent on that being your full-time source of income or source of fulfillment, but you get to still be involved. I'm really hoping to get a few more conservation projects going as well in the future. So here in Australia, there's been a lot more going into reptile conservation in the past decade. Government's finally getting on board with doing a lot more, which is exciting. So we've got a lot of species here that are critically endangered and they need the attention. So hopefully I can get on board with a few more of those as well.
What are some of the species that are endangered?
One that I'm potentially hoping to be involved in is Elis dragons. So there's many different species across the country. And just this week, they rediscovered one species that had been thought extinct, hadn't been seen for 50 years.
Wow.
So there's many different species of Elis dragons that are found in just one patch of forest here, there, or somewhere else across the country.
And is that just mainly a deforestation issue?
Yeah, and farming. A lot of Australia has been cleared for farming over the past few hundred years. So that's a big issue too.
Well, it's fascinating. You like I said at the beginning, you have a PhD. You work with venomous animals. You're in the zoo working with animals on a daily basis. You could pretty much move in any direction from here. You could do. There's so many facets that you could move down and stick within the reptile or herpetology world because you have that foundation. So you'll probably have an endless amount of things to keep you entertained.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly hope so too. There's a lot of trajectories I could go down, and as long as I'm working with reptiles, I mean, I'll never get bored. There's always something new and exciting to learn about them, or with keeping them as well. I'm definitely enjoying being at the zoo, being able to keep some species that I couldn't keep privately. Here in Australia, we can keep most native species, but in my opinion, to give them what they need is very hard from just what you can fit into, say, a small tank.
Yes.
So being at a zoo, being able to keep big monitor lizards like a parenti, and to be actually feel fulfilled with I'm keeping that the right way outdoors in a very big enclosure rather than cramming it into a tank in my house, things like that. That's another big perk as well.
Do you keep any of your private collection outside, or is everything inside?
Everything's inside, but I do hope to move a few things outdoors. Had a lot of shuffling around. I rent, so one thing I'm always aware of is might have to move this tank, I might have to move this animal in a year's time. But definitely outdoors. Where I am now in Townsville is good weather for keeping more humid species. So high humidity up here, and I keep leaf-tailed geckos, Australian leaf-tailed geckos. Cool. I'd love to try and keep them outdoors in a nice aviary in the future.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Yeah. Do you know Cooper Vanderwall?
Yeah, we've spoken a few times.
Okay, yeah. He has a really cool outdoor setups for his skinks, and I'm always jealous when I see it. I'm like, oh, it's just you have these little troughs, and the sunlight's taken care of for you. You can save some money on lighting, but it's just the amount of size and space that you can give them. It's pretty much impossible to do inside.
Yeah, definitely. For skinks too, like a lot of people, they get a blue tongue and they think, oh, it's a lizard. It'll sit there in this tank, and yeah, we'll sit there in that tank, but they move huge amounts if you give them the space to move.
Yeah.
So if you're keeping them outdoors, they become a whole different animal to keep.
Well, the first time I saw a blue tongue run on a video, like a wild blue tongue, I was floored. I couldn't believe how fast they can actually move. They actually almost look like they're slithering because you can't even see their little legs, and they're just like zipping through the grass. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. It's that's one thing too. It's like, if you keep an animal a certain way in an indoor enclosure, that's still good if you're doing it the right way and you're still providing that animal a good level of care. But that's still not natural. That's still not the natural habitat. If you give that animal that extra space, you can see that shift in how they behave.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Youngman, this was a fascinating conversation. Like, I think venom is one of those things that people are always just mystified by, especially if you're not part of that world, because it is, I would say it's almost like a mythical thing. The fact that there's animals out there that can bite you and inject poison into you or a toxin into you is really mind-blowing, and it's just everybody's always they want to hear more about it. So the fact that you got to do your PhD and work with some of the big names like Dr. Brian Fry is really, really cool. So can you let everybody know, if they want to keep track of what you're doing, playing with the Crocs and whatnot, where would they do that?
Yeah, so I use my Instagram account a fair bit. So Nick's Nature on Instagram. That's usually where I post most of my stuff that's going on reptile wise. And then if you're ever in Townsville, Billabong Sanctuary, come visit, come say hi to me. Always happy to have a chat.
Awesome. And I think if people on ResearchGate, can people find some of the papers that you've written?
And yeah, ResearchGate, I'm a little less active on there these days. But yeah, just Nicholas Youngman on ResearchGate as well. And that will have a link to most of my published papers on there.
Awesome. Well, this was a fascinating conversation and a pleasure to speak with you, Nick. So thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure. It was a good chat.
All right, that is the end of that episode. Dr. Youngman, thank you so much for spending the time with me today. I really appreciated that conversation. I think it's fascinating. Anything to do with venom is just like I said through the intro, everybody who's not in that world is just kind of scared and mystified and fascinated by it all at the same time. And I know I'm one of those people, so I really appreciate you breaking that down for us. And I also will have to make my way to Billabong Sanctuary at some point because I do need to see these Crocs in person. My mind cannot create an imagination powerful enough to see what that would be like. So I'll have to see it in person one day. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, the easiest way to help support the show is simply share it on social media, whether that's Facebook or Instagram. I always try to repost things that are shared about the show. So if you do share it, I'll try to reach out to you and say thanks, but also post it on my own page as well. If you would like to take the next step as far as supporting the show goes, you can go to patreon.com/animalsathome and chip in a couple of bucks. That really does go a long way to make sure the lights stay on in this room. Again, thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring the show and continuing to be a massive supporter of the podcast. If you would like to find more information on their enclosures, make sure you head to Animals at Home Network. No, don't go there. That's not the right website. Go to the show note links in the affiliate link in the show notes or the YouTube description. There you can find the link to Custom Reptile Habitats. And again, if you do make a purchase, a small commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. And I think that's it. I will see you guys in the next episode.